But let's just dive into, ocean and aquaculture, which is sort of the main theme or topic today. So was it just like the perfect coincidence that you ended up in this aquaculture space? Because I know that you were working with some ocean projects, but maybe you can just tell us the story on how you ended up, focusing so much on aquaculture. Because I mean, it's also like a personal story there, I guess, but it all just connects together in some sense.
It was the perfect setup of a number of coincidences kind of coming together. Um, you know, and I kind of referred to this earlier, but so I was working with Sylvia Earle, who is one of the greatest kind of ocean scientists in the world. She's from the US and she's been in the ocean space for decades. She still to this day, I believe, has walked deeper untethered on the ocean floor than anybody else, and just has incredible stories of being a pioneer in this space. And because she spent so long in the ocean, she can kind of tell you firsthand around the loss that's happening in the ocean. And working with Sylvia on really, this was, 2009, this started, realizing at the time, nobody was talking about the ocean. We had this kind of green movement, we were talking about the earth, but as she always said, like the earth is mostly water. We should be talking about ocean, not earth. Like we need the ocean to make the earth habitable. It was kind of one of those aha moments of how isn't this not the most urgent, pressing like issue for all of us to kind of wrap our heads around? And also you're with a lot of really committed, dedicated, like the ocean advocates are just, they've been out there and only kind of talking to each other in a lot of ways. And what I did with the TED Prize was help people get out of their worlds to engage different worlds, so that it wasn't necessarily scientists talking to scientists, but scientists could then, talk to funders and storytellers, designers, product designers, whomever it might be, in order to expand their vision. And when working with Sylvia, we were on one of the big parts of making her wish come true with the TED Prize was bringing 100 people to the Galapagos, people that were committed to doing something around ocean health, didn't know what yet. I met my partner, who is an entrepreneur from the Netherlands, on this boat. I think probably, I'd say almost all of the people on the boat are still really committed to doing something around oceans. Many of them have their whole livelihood is around ocean health right now, but it was a really transformative experience. Officially, 6 different initiatives were launched around creating marine protected areas and a couple of other things. A number of them were funded. Unofficially, the 7th initiative was AquaSpark. My partner and I wanted to do something together. We wanted it to be a business that affected ocean health. And we couldn't, there weren't like that many things around the ocean that we could think of starting a business with. One of the biggest issues was plastic. We saw at the time really just not using plastic, single-use plastic especially, as the way forward. The overfishing piece and how much we take from the ocean is hard to wrap your mind around, and trying to kind of stop commercial fishing practices and change them when you also know we have a massive and growing population to feed, was a little kind of confusing to navigate. We came upon aquaculture as a solution, and we were stunned that we had no idea that it was so big. It's now bigger. We produce more fish from aquaculture than we do from the wild for human consumption. It's larger than beef. It's a massive global industry. It's growing faster than any other food sector out there. And most people know nothing about it. It's been very opaque traditionally. There was no outside investment going into it. It's just, you kind of couldn't stop looking and wanting to know more and digging and digging and digging. It felt like we were starting to, this is kind of now 2011, moving into 2012, starting to really, like, there were some pioneers in the space really trying to produce sustainable fish, and we're doing so, but only able to sell them in really high-end markets at a crazy premium. But you figured, like, well, if you can produce the perfect trout for San Francisco, can't we scale alternative feed ingredients and figure out the right technology and kind of get scale solutions across the globe for different markets, different species, different systems, in order to kind of get all aquaculture there, and then make that the commercial norm, basically. And so we got more and more excited about this and dug in.
That's a great answer. I mean, there's so many key points that I want to, ask you about, but let's just start with, like, maybe it sounds like a simple question, but I think like we both have worked and work in this industry, so we don't usually talk so much about it, but just like start with a simple question, like, why do we need aquaculture? Because I think many people who are, watching Netflix documentaries about, some very, harshly maybe narratives, or reading, a Patagonia marketing campaign, maybe ask themselves the question, like, do we really need aquaculture at all, right? So if you can just start there, like, why do we need aquaculture? Maybe it's easier for people to understand where we are coming from.
I mean, first of all, it's, what is it, 1/3 of the world's population depends on aquaculture or fish as their major source of protein. If you look at where population growth is happening or forecast to happen, it's in those markets where fish is their main source of protein. Fish is an incredibly healthy source of protein. There's a lot of recent research by Rockefeller around kind of needing those nutrients for brain development, and that's kind of going to lift us all. And if you look at eats, after eat and Lansing's, I think they took 10 years to figure out what the perfect diet is around both sustainability and human health, and well-farmed fish was a big piece of that. But I don't think people realize how well we can produce fish either. Yes, some aquaculture has challenges, and we didn't know as much 10 years ago as we know now, and there have been some kind of messy patchworks to fix mistakes along the way. But there's also, the potential to farm aquaculture, farm fish in a way better than any other kind of animal protein. We can do it with very little water. The farm we were talking about before we started, we have an Atlantic halibut farm in Norway. They farm a kilo of halibut for less than a kilo of feed, right? Like we can create systems that are really efficient. We can use insects, single cell proteins, microbes, algae as feed ingredients. We can do aquaculture really different than we've historically been doing aquaculture. And this is like the superb, sustainable future of aquaculture. But actually, even now, if you look at kind of greenhouse gas footprint of aquaculture versus other proteins, it's already kind of way down and the better solution.
But don't you just think, like, it's interesting because you also have, the US perspective. And I mean, I've talked to a lot of people in US that don't know anything about aquaculture at all. So it's also like, I feel there are like some points here, like when you do something in big scale, like aquaculture, obviously it's going to be trade-offs, right? Whatever you do in like big scale is going to have some problems you need to solve. But it also just seems to me like, there's a huge educational piece that needs to be solved. Because if you take, like, just you mentioned water, right? Imagine when you make beef, the water consumption is crazy, and water is a scarce resource. So there's so many points that maybe I don't think the normal person really understands, because they never looked at the data.
It's a really good point. And it would frustrate me like crazy when we were initially out there talking about this, and everyone would talk about aquaculture being bad. And I was like, well, what do we eat instead? Beef? I mean, what's the alternative here? And now you have people saying that, cell-based and plant-based are the alternatives, and they will be part of the solution for sure, a big part. But I don't think we're ever going to be able to produce tilapia as well, as efficiently, as affordably, for example, in a lab, or as we are in a farm. And that's an extreme example, but I could name a number of species that fit that bill as well. I think part of our mission is to really just get people to understand what aquaculture is. 15 years ago, people generally didn't pay that much attention to what we were eating. Like labels weren't that honest. So that's shifted greatly in our advantage as well. People actually are starting. So yes, they have kind of misinformed ideas. At least they're caring about how their food is produced and want to know more. And now it's our kind of in the industry's collective challenge to really be way more transparent, to tell the story and to show and to get it right. So it's a story we're proud to tell around kind of replacing antibiotics, greening feed, reducing water, land use, et cetera, and really showing how well we can produce this perfect protein.
Definitely. So just an interesting question, like you're based in Netherlands right now. How much do you feel like the cultural differences between maybe Europe and US, do you feel like they're all on the same page, or is it like huge difference in terms of what they value and how they view the world in the food supply chain?
So I don't want to generalize, and actually I'm usually in bubbles in both places where everybody passionately cares about kind of food production. But if I am to generalize, I will say that the Netherlands is surrounded by water. You grow up with water, such a part of your life. And so that connection to sea and sea life is just a part of you. And that is not the case in most of the US, except for coastal areas. And the Netherlands also just ingrains the idea of sustainability. It's a small country, and food production and resource use is really kind of reasonable and thought out here. So you grow up with a real sense of how to live in a sustainable manner, especially regarding food.
That makes sense. So just looking at the cases you have funded, because it's super interesting because you fund projects from all over the world, right? Mm-hmm. And I mean, there's such a huge difference between, aquaculture in Norway compared to Southeast Asia, pros and cons everywhere. But just talk a bit about, the differences you see, because I mean, regulation is different, technology is different, people have different needs, nations have different needs. So just talk about, the global spectrum and everything you see and how much, it varies, because it has to vary a bit, going from Africa to Norway to US, etc.
I mean, absolutely. We really intentionally created this global portfolio because when we first started sort of looking at aquaculture, it felt like such an uncoordinated space where, markets weren't connected at all. And like lessons and knowledge weren't being transferred. You were seeing kind of tech being developed for very specific markets that was never really going to be adoptable or accessible to others. And that in kind of really thinking of aquaculture as a connected global industry, that in itself would start to resolve some of the problems we were seeing. So yeah, we invest all over the world, and you're right. It's very different environments, different markets, different culture, but a lot of farming issues or challenges are shared, right? When it comes to kind of understanding the biology of a species, monitoring for and dealing with disease, knowing how to kind of optimize feeding and be the most resource efficient you can. So we see very different types of technologies, but a lot of the same they're trying to solve a lot of the same things. Like we were invested in an automatic smart feeding company in Indonesia that uses sensors to measure fish and shrimp appetite, only feeds when they're hungry, saves up to 24% of fish feed each cycle, improves growth rate, makes more consistent growth happen, but also creates a ton of farm data that is able to then serve farmers with financing and help them access markets. So it's become this full IoT solution that works perfectly in Indonesia, and I assume will when it expands to other shrimp markets and fish markets in the region. But we have a similar solution with a company in Norway, Blue Grove, that monitors kind of fish behavior. And you think of Norway and salmon as so much further advanced when it comes to feeding, right? You walk into a farm in Norway and you see all these cameras, you're like in the biggest control room of your life, but you realize it's still humans watching feed and it's still not that optimal. You're still losing a lot of feed. A lot's going to the bottom of the sea. Fish aren't necessarily always kind of growing at the most productive they can be. Where in Indonesia, it's kind of murky, muddy water. So you really can't see where the feed's going. So you see what that can solve. But it's been interesting to see that, you know, so different technologies, it's the same conversation in a lot of ways with getting farmers to adopt technology and kind of transform their practices. It almost feels in some ways, I shouldn't make this statement because this is so more anecdotal, but we're seeing kind of tech start to scale more in Southeast Asia than we are. Do you see me saying it really slowly because I'm afraid to make it? But it could be the affordability of the technology. It could be a lot of different reasons, and it's starting to move in Northern Europe, but it seems like it's taken a longer time to get some of these tech solutions to start to take off there.